Good morning, and thank you for the welcome. And thank you also for allowing me to do this speech in English, as I don't think I would be able to do it as justly if I was speaking in German today. Today is a really wonderful opportunity to share, and I hope that over the next 30 minutes, I can share some insight in both my personal journey as an inclusion practitioner and how Tate is also changing as a whole. I will offer up some examples of the work we've undertaken and hopefully share some learnings. Now, when I say I share learnings, hopefully this is a safe space in which I can do that, because sometimes I get myself in trouble when I tell some too much truths of this organization. I hope also to convey with this platform that we aren't getting everything right. I don't want to stand up here and say, oh, Tate is doing the best in this place. But what I do want to say is that we're trying and sharing what we're trying to do. I also would be very strange for me not to recognize that we are in very, very strange political waters. Even in registering for the speaking at this event, Brexit was a real concern. About 12 days post the original deadline, would we actually still be able to be stood here on this platform? We have an election in the UK right now. There is also the very real risk that the arts will be reduced in the curriculum for children. We have issues around access to funding. We know that when Brexit does come around, there is going to be an impact on tourism. What do all these things mean for us? I also want to stand up here and recognize that I'm a cisgender white gay man, and it is the privilege of my role as a diversity inclusion manager to talk about these issues, but I will potentially talk about communities in which I don't identify with. And it's important in my practice to register that straight away. I also want to recognize that I'm one of the only diversity inclusion managers in the cultural sector. In London, in the art gallery sector, there is no one else doing my role in any other art gallery. Some places will have an access officer, so someone who looks after program for disabled visitors. Some people will have a HR practitioner who might be responsible for diversifying recruitment. But I'm the only person who looks after the whole package in our galleries. And I think this is testament to Tate's vision around diversity and inclusion, which has started since 2006, and Emily's going to talk more about that, where as a museum, when we were facing cuts, we still invested in a diversity and inclusion program. We still lent into those areas and prioritized it because we thought it was important. But before I start, I have a secret to tell you. It's a big secret. It's a really big secret. And I'm hoping I can trust you with it. I'm a rugby player. That's right. Every weekend, I go and throw myself at 20 stone men in Essex. But I tell you what, being a rugby player in an art gallery is awesome. It's awesome. I'm going to take you back to 2017 when I arrived at Tate. I'd been there a month. I'd played in the weekend, 2 massive black eyes. Had a meeting with some trustees. Have gotten everything I've ever wanted since. I did have to, though, write an article on our staff notice board to talk about the gay rugby team that I play with, and that these black eyes weren't because I'd been spending the weekend fighting or anything that was really in that respect. So, rugby for me, though, is a sport that demonstrates what my inclusion practice is about. And I know rugby is not a major sport here in Germany, so I will explain some of that for you. Rugby is a sport that needs people of different shapes. You need the big guys, you need the fast guys, you need those who can catch, those that can tackle, those that can, like me, just stand over and look a bit scary in this picture. But rugby is a game that's won by inches. It's not run by one single thing that will completely save a game. It is about a whole team bringing together all of those different people who might look different, have different skills, different things that make them great, and inch by inch moving across a field. And for me, that is the core of my inclusion practice. is recognizing everyone as individuals, finding out what they're bringing to the table, and then creating that team that incrementally makes changes. We are Tate, a 200-year-old institution. We are not going to change anything overnight. It needs to be regular and consistent change. So I hope that the key thing that I can get across to you today is around some of the practice in which we are doing and how this is a regular and ongoing learning journey. When I arrived at Tate, and I think this is the same across many of the cultural sector, the doors were open. Everybody was inclusive. Everybody was welcoming. We welcome everybody to our galleries. And when you scratch that surface and you ask, what does that mean? There wasn't really a framework of which that sits behind. What does it mean to welcome a wheelchair user into a building where there's too many steps? What does it mean to reflect the communities of London and the school children who are coming through the school's program? So I talk a lot about intention. How do we go from what we've had to what we want to have? And this is where I think diversity is a coin. Diversity and inclusion are two sides of a coin. Diversity is your truth. This is what you're representing right now. And inclusion is the culture in which that is operating. And I hope to share that more in the next 30 minutes. So where is Tate? Where is it all at Tate? Where's the leadership? What's going on at Tate? In 2017, Marie Balshaw took over as director of Tate and set out with this vision. And it seemed to us like a bit of a step change. Diversity inclusion wasn't a new thing. Being culturally inclusive was not a new thing. But it was actually one of the first times we were being very explicit about it. And this is our new vision: to serve as artistically adventurous and culturally inclusive art museums for the UK and the world that are open, bold, rigorous, and kind in all we do. Emily will talk a bit more about our history and the project that's been looking at that time since 2006. But this vision really does articulate our future when it comes to inclusion. And for me, when I talk to new members of staff, I ask this question of, what actually does a culturally inclusive art museum look like? And I ask every new member of staff into our organization that question. And generally, we find it breaks into 5 key areas. The first, does our audience reflect the UK and the world? How do we know? What are we doing to test that? We are civic spaces funded by the government, funded by the taxpayers. These buildings should be for all. Second, are the artists that we're collecting and valuing, do they reflect the UK and the world? Or are we still continuing to perpetuate what is valuable in society? Thirdly, are the staff who work at these organizations, do they reflect the cities and regions in which we operate? Now, for the 2 galleries and the 2 houses in London, that's very different to a gallery that's in Cornwall. And are we giving that flexibility and that understanding of the communities in which we operate in the due thinking that it's needed? We also talk about our accessibility. And I'm sure in questions, there might be some questions about our Liaison exhibition, if anyone's been watching Twitter over the summer, and I'll come back to that. And by that, we both mean physical accessibility, access to our collection, intellectual accessibility, socioeconomic accessibility, how we write, what are we writing about, who is getting access to what. And that is why it's really, really scary for us about the idea of arts being reduced in its value in the curriculum. How are we going to continue that? And finally, is also about how we value art and how we talk about it. And I know you probably have touched on issues around decolonization. You've probably talked about issues about interpretation and reducing the Western lens on interpretation, and how are we doing all of that. So those are the 5 key things that always come out with new member of staff who wants to come to Tate. But why inclusion? What are our reasons? And this should come up. And our reasons I'm going to argue in this last 20 minutes is they're based on a moral, creative, legal, and a business case. And that, as a practitioner, I feel that sometimes in one sentence, I can go from any one of these. I can go between these. And there's one on there about the political case of sometimes when you want stuff to happen around diversity inclusion, you've got to make a leader feel good about it. It's going to make them look good. But I want to spend time on each of these individual areas and talk about a specific project which I think has represented what we our practice at Tate. And I'm going to start with almost the easy one, which is the legal case. Because we are, in the UK, we have something called the Equality Act. And the Equality Act, since 2010, harmonized 40 years of legislation that was operating public service. In 2010, that act defined bullying, harassment, and discrimination, and it enhanced the protections of marginalized communities. Now, we have 9 protected characteristics. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but what the key point for a public organization is that A, you need to start representing everybody who are in these communities, and you need to foster good relations. And that's a key point in this Equality Act. In this summer, I'm going to talk about Lyson. We hosted an exhibition. In that exhibition was a piece of work that was inaccessible to wheelchairs. We potentially, this is where I'm oversharing and I might have to edit the video afterwards, but we were potentially placing our organization at risk by having this object in the gallery. But even further, the work we didn't do with that disabled person who complained about us was not fostering a good relation with that community. So even the decisions we're making, it's also about how we're interacting with communities. This law, though, however, often falls short. It's not necessarily keeping up with language around gender. It does not offer necessarily the protections that we want it to around carers, same-sex families. So even though it's only 9 years old, there are still things that diversity and inclusion is changing faster than even our legislation is keeping up with. But equally, it touches on our link to the government. We are funded by taxpayers. And because of this act, the Department for Culture, Media, Sports and Arts Council are taking diversity and inclusion seriously. They are asking questions about what are we doing to meet the Equality Act. We report on that annually. However, I would argue that as institutions, and this might be something you are able to see as well, that often the work we're doing is better than what we're being asked of. The sector as a whole, the bar is quite low. Its bar is quite low. So many institutions are going above and beyond the basic minimums they're being asked by the government. And that's an important area to think about. The legal case is always the stick. It's always the last thing I come to. It's always, hopefully I would use my other talents and skills before we get to the legal case. But very often, sometimes it's good having this in the back pocket, because if you ever need to get something going and you go, well, actually, there's a bit of a legal risk, I can guarantee it works much quicker than just trying to bring someone on that journey. But it's not the most important for me, but it is there as a proper, solid foundation. What is more important for me is the moral case. And I meet every new member of staff. And one of the things that we've undertaken over the last three to 4 years is an inclusive leadership program. Now, that program talked about issues of unconscious bias, talked about power and privilege, microaggressions, and how that rolls out in society every day. 1,400 people have attended that training course, and every new member of staff gets to meet me in their first 6 months, and they undertake that training with me. What that is about is setting out our standards. However, Going on one training course does not make Tate more inclusive tomorrow. This is about an ongoing leadership exercise. And I really want to be clear about when I talk about inclusive leadership, I'm not talking about the leaders of our institutions. Everybody is part of inclusive leadership. No matter the sphere of influence in which you're operating, you all have a role, especially at Tate, and I very scare all those new starters by saying you all have a role, in order to help us on this journey. It is not just going to be led by Maria Balshaw or the directors group. It has to be the whole organization that undertakes that. The moral case, though, is almost an easy one as well. We are a civic space. We are funded by taxpayers. Everybody should feel welcome in our buildings and represented in our buildings. No one should be working, volunteering, or visiting us that wants to actively discriminate against somebody else. Unfortunately, it does happen. With 8.5 million visitors a year, we still have issues that we have to reflect. But I want to touch on, in this case, on a specific example around our workforce. And this is an example, I think, that is about a moral case, not about any minimum standards or legal case. And that is to enable Tate's people to thrive and shift the workforce more closely to reflect the UK population today is a core objective in our new 5-year plan. So we don't have a separate D&I strategy that's over here that's being governed by some people who are interested in it. It's core and central of our 5-year objectives. That means every director needs to be considering how their team's contributing to this. My role in this is to ensure that those directors are confident with this. Do they know the data about their recruitment practices? Do they know who's working in their divisions? And in the UK, I recognize that we have the ability to ask when you apply for a job for your diversity data. We ask you about your identity. At Tate, we're really lucky because we have 90% return rates on our diversity data. So 90% of the organization, I know how that breaks down in terms of the communities or their identity. So that means I can go to very quickly to a director and say, your department is not representing where you're operating. Why? What do you need? What can we provide you? What support do you need? Is it training? Is it better recruitment practices? Is it better interview skills training? And that is a better conversation than we've ever had before. Because if we just purely say, okay, we're going to meet the UK population, but we're operating in London, which is more diverse than the UK population, we're in a false economy. And we're never really going to be shifting our conversation. So data becomes really important. But as I said, data is half the conversation. You can present the data, but then those changes can be made, but if someone still comes into the organization and is facing microaggressive behavior every day, transphobia in the changing rooms, visitors and members asking inappropriate questions, we are not going to retain those people. Why would they want to come and put themselves in these spaces? And that's where I'm going to join on the creative case. So the creative case is a really interesting one. Many institutions have the same problems that are on the horizon. In the UK, Brexit is something that we are worried about. The reduction in priority of the arts in the curriculum is a thing we're worried about. We need diversity in our staff to be thinking creatively about our solutions. And I want to talk in this area about our staff diversity networks. So one of my roles is to create community practice internally. So to bring people with a shared equality characteristic together, to understand the experience of working in an organization like Tate, and to make change. We have 4 staff networks. We have a race network, a disability network, a network for those with dependents, so parents and carers network, and we have an LGBTQ+ network that focuses on sexual orientation and trans identities. And those networks have been around since 2012. So we have a huge history of bringing those communities together, engaging with directors in the very specific issues, and then making change, both in policy, training, conversation, and even in our program. This image here was last summer at Tate Britain, where we had a commission which was all about a squash, a character called the Squash, who moved around our divines. But outside, as part of that commission, the artist got us to create a community garden space. At the end of the commission was coming, our race network came forward and said, we want to run an event. And that network curated in the space this event that held discourse about the barriers to cultural institutions and race, about the idea that our facade on our front door will be a reason why people won't come in, that brought different voices into the grounds that had never been there before, and invited and ensured that directors were present to hear those things. This year, there was a phenomenal event for us called Starting Points, because often what we find is that in the network, we're having these great conversations, but outside of that network, people are not having those conversations. And they're almost the people who need to have those conversations. So our race network again ran an event called Starting Points. It was a table sat in a room, 12 seats only, and you could only speak if you were sat at the table. Anybody else was welcome to sit anywhere and occupy the space anywhere else and listen. Nick Verk and the team, Nick Verk, who was the chair, facilitated that conversation, particularly asking people of color to step forward and share their experiences. What that offered was a space and a time for somebody who may not have engaged in race their whole life. They may have been uncomfortable about even talking about race, to come into a space and listen, to take on board what was being said, and to hopefully have taken their journey a little bit further so that they could go away and they could go and do some self-learning. I want to caveat some of that, though, because this work is hard. This work is hard. It is draining. It's exhausting. And if you are marginalized in your organization already, to be a change agent is even more tiring. To constantly be the person who's seen as the person who's going to justify this or bring this lens into a space, it is tiring. And my role is to support staff who already have full-time jobs, who run these networks, to think about self-care, to think about how do you protect your own personal profile in your career, in the organization. How do you create allies that will do this work for you? What does that mean to inspire, to encourage, and to provide the foundations, but not be expected to do this work? And I don't think we've got that right. Don't think we've got that right. I think since I joined the organization in 2017, those communities are forming better. They are definitely coming together, and we have a structure and a governance for those networks. They each have a director sponsor, so a champion at director level, and they present at every directors group. They take it in turns, and they have 10 minutes to present what is happening. But I know that the cohort of chairs I've had, 90% of them have just said, we've done this for 2 years, we're tired, we cannot continue to do this. So I have a new cohort of 25 chairs where we are focusing in on care programs. What does it mean to make change? What does an organization need to support you with to do that? And that's not by giving you a title change maker, because you're already doing this work every day. It is about making sure that we are providing the right learning environment, the right training, the right mentoring, the right support, and a whole system approach to somebody. The final area I want to talk about is the business case. And I think this is something that we've really learned over in the years that I've been there for sure. Explicitly representing people in our galleries changes our audience profile. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that would be the case? And in particular, I'm going to just touch on something called Queer British Art, which was in 2017, one of the first shows, a collection show of LGBT artists running up to 1969. At the same time, we had a show at Tate Modern called Soul of a Nation, which looked at the Black Power movement in America. First time, really, that Tate had... so there's two ways of telling this story. Sometimes it's like, oh, we took a chance on this. And others like, oh, we led on this type of show. Depends on who you talk to. These group shows that were definitely thinking about something, social identity, and definitely placing that in the program, in the exhibition space. This picture here is from our day festival, Queer and Now, where we took over the whole of Tate Britain, and we had a voguing workshop in the middle of our big gallery. What we saw in that gallery space is we saw for Queer British Art, 60% of the audience were LGBT. 60%. In both shows, they were the youngest veering show that we've ever run. So our average audience age drove right down, particularly under 35s, which I'm sure we're all competing for right now, is that audience. What was really interesting is that these weren't audiences new to culture. In both shows, people said that they were interacting with cultural institutions elsewhere. They were just not interested in Tate until these shows came along. And that was a very interesting point for us to think about. In both shows, 18% over audience targets, 30% over targets in budget. And I find that was one of the really interesting things. And this is where I'm being filmed, so I'm not sure how much more I can say there. But the conversations leading up to these shows, how much resource are we going to put in here? How much risk is this? Are we going to lower the price of tickets because these are groups that are marginalized by us already? What are we saying about them? Those conversations were sticky and not great, and we've made lots of learnings. But we do know that that's changed our thinking. And in the last 2 years, our program has shifted. We have a significantly more amount of queer artists being represented. We have significantly increased the amount of artists who identify as Black, Asian, or minority ethnic in the gallery, in the public collection, in the exhibition. Cara Walker has just made a phenomenal commission into Tate Modern. But we can't just say, oh, well, right now we're going to start doing this work. We're also thinking about our history. Tate Britain in particular history. The history of Henry Tate. How do we reevaluate that? How do we think about that? And going through some research and some experts. There's some exciting projects next year about how do we change the interpretation text. I'm sure like many, we have a practice where we might change the public space. How deep are we going in reviewing the interpretation text? How are we making sure that a text that reflects colonial history or that is pretty much I'm being filmed. I must remember I'm being filmed. That is erasing histories. How are we telling better stories? And the only way we're going to do that is if we have lived experience in the workforce. If we have structures that support individuals to tell us, you're getting this wrong. You're not doing this the way we want it. So we launched a text inbox project last year where we opened the doors up to the public and said, if you find something that we haven't seen, tell us, and we will review it. And we won't just review it like we've reviewed everything else. We will work with those that we've impacted to change what that looks like. So, I started talking about, at the start of my talk, about slides about a rugby team. And how there are many, I'm just going to check, I've got one more slide. How there are many facets to a successful team. Not one of these are examples, not one of these examples are going to change Tate tomorrow. And actually, a successful rugby team needs lots of practice, lots of training, lots of coaching, lots of learning. There is no silver bullet that changes inequality in society. But I'll leave you with this. What is your role on the rugby team? What influence can you have today? And what meaningful change can you make tomorrow? And how do you continue to push your organization inch by inch while also looking after yourself? Thank you, and open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much.